lonely old rancher who'd given up on rain until a young tinkerer brought water. Back in a godforsaken corner of the West Nolan's ranch exhaled despair, stubborn pride, and a suffocating silence. The man himself, a ghost of sun-scorched leather and grit, waged a silent war against the dry well pump. His knuckles were white on the iron handle, his jaw set against the hollow groan of metal on metal, a testament to his unyielding stubbornness. He knew the aquifer was dead, had been for years, but Nolan was a man who wouldn't acknowledge the corn. Every screech of the mechanism was a phantom echo of a woman's scream, the dust carrying the ghost scent of scorched wood, a memory he'd tried to bury deeper than any well. But as the sun beat down, a new shadow fell across the yard. Not a buzzard. A girl no older than 14, with eyes that didn't see a broken man but a broken machine. He thought the drought was his enemy. He was about to discover the real war was with the ghosts within, and his only salvation would come speaking the language of gears and grease. The only sound on Nolan's ranch was the groan of a dying machine. It was a mournful, rasping noise that grated on the soul, the sound of metal screaming for a water it could no longer find. In a god-forsaken corner of the West, the property exhaled despair, stubborn pride, and a suffocating silence, a stillness broken only by that defeated cry. The man himself, a ghost of sun-scorched leather and grit, waged his silent war against the dry well pump. He leaned his weight into the iron handle muscles coiling in his arms, a lifetime of hard labor distilled into one more useless pull. The pump answered with a dry, hollow cough, spitting a puff of pale dust into the shimmering heat. Dust. Only dust. The well was dead. He knew it had known it for months, but Nolan was a man who wouldn't acknowledge the corn. To stop fighting this pump would be to admit the land had finally won. To admit that he had failed. Again. Every screech of the mechanism was a phantom echo, a tearing sound that scraped at a memory locked deep inside him. It sounded almost like a woman's scream, the dust carrying the ghost scent of scorched wood, a nightmare he'd tried to bury deeper than any well. He released the handle, letting it fall with a weary clang. He stood for a long moment, a statue of defiance in a kingdom of decay, his gaze lost in the vast merciless blue of the sky. That's when he saw the shadow. It fell across the cracked earth of the yard, long and thin in the afternoon light. It wasn't a buzzard circling overhead waiting. It was something else. He squinted his hand, shielding his eyes. A girl. She was standing by the collapsed fence line, simply watching him. She was no older than 14, small for her age, with a tangle of dark hair that fell over her face. She wasn't looking at him with pity, not like the folks from town did on their rare, unwelcome visits. Her gaze was fixed on the pump, her head tilted with an unnerving, clinical curiosity. In her hand she held a worn, grease-stained notebook. He didn't move. He just watched her watch his failure. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Finally, she began to walk toward him, her steps sure and deliberate, kicking up small clouds of the ever-present dust. She stopped a few feet from the well, her eyes scanning the entire mechanism from the handle to the cracked base. "It's your piston seal," she said. Her voice was clear, direct, and held no trace of childishness. It was the voice of a diagnosis. "It's shot. Worn right through. You're pulling more air than anything." Nolan's jaw tightened. The intrusion, the sheer audacity of it, sent a jolt of raw anger through him. What would a little girl know about seals and pistons? He growled, his voice rough from disuse. She ignored his tone completely, as if it were just an irrelevant noise. And it wouldn't matter anyway. She continued, tapping a finger on her notebook. "Your well's too shallow. The aquifer's dropped clear past it. All you're doing is tiring yourself out." She opened the notebook. It was filled not with drawings of flowers or horses, but with intricate diagrams of gears, levers, and strange-looking contraptions. She pointed to a complex sketch. You need to go deeper. And a hand pump won't give you the leverage. You need something to do the work for you. You need the wind." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a fierce mechanical intelligence. "You need a windmill." The word struck Nolan like a physical blow. A windmill. A newfangled machine. A promise of a solution powered by some invisible fickle force. It was hope packaged in metal and wood, and he hated it. Hope was the cruelest poison of all. It was the same lie that had betrayed him all those years ago. "Get out!" He snarled, the words ripped from that deep scarred place in his soul. "Get off my land!" He turned his back on her, a final, absolute dismissal. "I don't need your machines, and I don't need your help. Some things are best left buried." A week passed, marked not by days, but by the deepening cracks in the earth. The sun was a hammer beating the hope out of the land, one relentless blow at a time. Nolan's cattle stood with their heads low, their ribs showing like the weathered boards on the barn, their silent suffering a constant low-level accusation. The world had shrunk to the size of this parched, hopeless ground, and Nolan's heart had shrunk with it. Then one morning he found it on his porch. A new page from the girl's notebook, this one, a clean, impossibly detailed diagram of a pump's gearing mechanism. It was weighted down by a small, heavy brass gear scavenged from the guts of an old clock that shone with a defiant, mocking brightness. He almost threw it into the dust. Almost. Instead, he took it inside the cold weight of the metal, a strange and unwelcome presence in his hand. She returned that afternoon as he knew she would. She moved with the quiet inevitability of the setting sun, a small persistent force that his anger could not seem to scare away. She didn't come to his door this time. She walked to the flat barren space beside the well and began to unload her treasures. They were the bones of other failures, a rusted wagon axle, twisted sheets of tin, a length of heavy chain that looked like it had been pulled from a riverbed. She laid them out with the care of a surgeon arranging his instruments, her small frame belying the strength it took to haul the heavy, awkward pieces. She was building something from nothing. From ruin, she was conjuring a resurrection. Nolan watched from the shade of his porch, a storm of resentment and a terrible flickering curiosity warring within him. He was a man drowning, and this child was offering him a strange, complicated rope he did not trust. But the thirst was real. The silence of his dying ranch was real. He could not stand it anymore. He strode out into the punishing sunlight, his boots crunching on the gravel, each step a surrender. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice a low growl. The girl didn't look up. She was trying to fit the scavenged gear from the clock onto the end of the wagon axle. "The ratio is wrong," she murmured more to herself than to him. "The torque will be too high. I'll need to fashion a reducer." "Are you deaf?" Nolan's voice rose cracking in the dry air. "This is my land. My curse. You have no part in it." For the first time she stopped her work and looked directly at him. Her eyes were clear and startlingly direct, free of fear or deference. "The land doesn't care whose curse it is, mister. It just cares about water." She gestured with a greasy hand toward the pile of metal. "I can't lift this axle alone. Are you going to help me, or are you going to watch your cows die?" The brutal, simple logic of it struck him silent. It was a choice, a final, humiliating choice between his pride and their survival. He looked at her small, determined face, then at the vast, empty sky, and felt the last of his resistance crumble into dust. "Fine," he rasped the word, tasting like defeat. "I'll help you build your contraption." He pointed a thick finger at her. "But know this. The moment it fails, and it will fail, you disappear. You don't come back. You don't leave your little drawings. We are done. Is that clear?" The girl simply nodded, once her expression unreadable, and turned back to the axle. "I'll need the forge," was all she said. The days that followed were forged in sweat and silence. They worked. The clang of Nolan's hammer on hot metal became the ranch's new, hesitant heartbeat. He had the strength. She had the vision. A strange rhythm formed between them, a partnership built of necessity and the shared language of physical work. One afternoon, while hoisting a heavy timber into place to form the tower's leg, the rope slipped. The massive beam swung sideways directly toward Lily. Without thinking, without hesitating, Nolan moved. He lunged, shoving her hard, sending her tumbling into the dust as the timber crashed down where she had just been standing. He took the glancing blow on his shoulder, the impact a dull, heavy shock. He stood over her, breathing hard, his shoulder throbbing. "I told you," he started to yell, but the words died in his throat. She was looking up at him, her face pale with fright, but her eyes held something new. Not gratitude, something closer to recognition. He grunted, turning away to hide the strange protective instinct that had seized him. "Watch yourself," he muttered. He walked to his canteen, took a long swallow, then paused. He looked back at the girl who was slowly getting to her feet, brushing the dust from her clothes. He held out the canteen. "Here." She took it without a word, her small, greasy fingers brushing against his calloused ones. The water they shared in the silence that followed was the first real promise of rain that this dry, broken land had seen in years. The tower rose from the cracked earth like a prayer made of wood and iron. It was a skeletal sculpture against the vast, empty canvas of the sky, a thing of both promise and folly, and it became the center of Nolan's world. The days settled into a new rhythm, a cadence not of despair, but of purpose. It was a rhythm of hammer strikes and the low rasp of a metal file, of shared grunts of effort and long contemplative silences that were no longer hostile. They worked. From the first blush of dawn until their shadows grew long and distorted, they built their strange monument to the wind. Nolan found himself watching the girl. He had started by watching for her mistakes, but now he watched in a kind of quiet awe. He saw how her mind worked, how she could look at a pile of junk and see a functioning system. She would close her eyes and trace patterns in the air with a greasy finger, her lips moving silently, calculating angles and stresses in a language he could not comprehend. "That notebook," he said one afternoon, his voice startling them both. "Where'd a girl like you learn to read a gear like that?" Lily didn't look up from the piece of metal she was shaping. "My pa's," she said softly. "He was a watchmaker. From back east. A watchmaker." Nolan repeated the words, feeling foreign in this land of big, brutal things. "He said a watch is just a big world in a small box." She continued, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Sun, moon, seasons. All just gears turning in harmony. He taught me the harmony." Nolan fell silent, the image of a tiny, perfect machine, a stark contrast to his own broken world. He thought of his wife's locket, a small silver thing he kept in a box, a world that had stopped turning long ago. He looked at the girl, her face smudged with grease, her brow furrowed in concentration as she solved a problem with a complex linkage. "All right, Sprocket." He grunted the name coming to him unbidden. "Let's see if your harmony works on a bigger scale." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw a real smile. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of a life lived too hard too soon. The day they hoisted the blades was a day of breathless, anxious heat. The assembly, a clumsy fan of sailcloth and repurposed tin, was heavier than it looked. It took all their combined strength, a system of ropes and pulleys, and a fair amount of swearing from Nolan to get it into place. The final bolt was tightened. The ropes were released. They stepped back, their chests heaving, and looked up. It was done. The windmill stood complete, a strange, beautiful sentinel against the endless sky. And it waited. The air was still. A hawk circled lazily overhead. A long, tense minute passed. Nolan felt a familiar, bitter taste in his mouth. failure. Then he felt it on the back of his neck, a whisper of movement in the air, a cool breath on a hot day. The wind. It came softly at first. The giant blades trembled, then groaned as the gears engaged for the first time. A deep wooden creak echoed across the yard. Then another. Slowly, majestically, with the great, powerful rhythm of a rising giant, the blades began to turn. They caught the wind, each rotation smoother than the last, a slow, hypnotic dance. The pump rod connected to the hub began its steady, plunging motion. Up, down. A new heartbeat for a dead land. A sound escaped Nolan's throat, a rough, ragged thing that might have been a laugh. A true, unbidden smile cracked the dry earth of his face. It worked. The impossible, beautiful thing actually worked. Hope, terrifying and brilliant, surged through him, a feeling so long forgotten it felt like a stranger in his own heart. His moment of triumph was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A lone rider, an old rancher named Jedediah from the next valley over, reined in his horse, his face a mask of disbelief as he stared at the turning windmill. Tarnation, Nolan. Jedediah whistled, his eyes wide. What in God's name is that? That Nolan said, his voice filled with a pride that was fierce and new, is the future Jed. Jedediah's gaze shifted from the windmill to the western horizon. His easy disbelief hardened into something else. Concern. Maybe he said, his voice low and serious. He pointed with a weathered chin. But you'd better hope it's a sturdy one. Nolan followed his gaze. A thin dark line was smudged across the horizon like a bruise on the flawless blue sky. It was growing, darkening, swallowing the light. That ain't a summer shower comin', Jedediah said, pulling his horse's reins tight. That's a tempest, the kind that peels the bark off trees and sends boulders rollin'. Seen one like it back in '78. It'll tear that newfangled thing of yours to splinters. He gave Nolan a last pitying look, tipped his hat, and spurred his horse into a gallop, anxious to be home before the hammer fell. Nolan stood frozen, his smile gone, the warmth in his chest turning to ice. He looked up at the beautiful turning blades, a symbol of his newfound hope, now silhouetted against a sky that promised nothing but annihilation. The wind was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. It was a physical beast that rose from the bruised purple-black horizon and slammed into the valley, stealing the breath from the air. The beautiful, hopeful day died in an instant, choked by a sky the color of a fresh wound. The dust, once a fine powder, was now a blinding, stinging curtain of grit, lifted and hurled with malevolent force. Nolan stood frozen for a half-second, the memory of Jedediah's warning a cold stone in his gut. He looked at the windmill. Its blades, which had turned with such gentle grace only minutes before, were now spinning with a frantic, high-pitched shriek, a sound of mechanical terror, as the gears strained against a power they were never meant to handle. Hope was a fragile, beautiful thing, and the storm had come to kill it. The ropes, he yelled, his voice torn away by the wind the moment it left his lips. Lily was already moving. She didn't need to be told. She was a whirlwind of purpose, her small form braced against the gale as she ran for the barn, emerging moments later with the heavy coils of rope they had used to hoist the blades. They met at the base of the tower, the world around them dissolving into a maelstrom of noise and fury. The air grew thick, heavy tasting of ozone and raw earth. The first drops of rain fell not as a blessing, but as hard-stinging pellets that struck their faces like flung gravel. "We have to furl it," Lily screamed over the din, her eyes wide but fiercely focused. "If we don't tie down the blades, the hub will shear right off." Nolan just nodded, his face a grim mask. He had built this thing. He would not let the sky tear it down. He would not fail again. The climb was a nightmare. The wooden rungs of the ladder were slick with the first wave of rain, the wind a giant unseen hand trying to pry them loose and cast them into the chaos below. Every foot gained was a battle, every gust of wind a threat of annihilation. The windmill itself seemed to be screaming, the shriek of the spinning blades blending with the deep groaning agony of the wooden tower as it shuddered under the assault. They climbed two small defiant figures, ascending into the heart of the tempest, the ground falling away into a churning sea of dust and rain. They were halfway up when the sky split open. A single colossal fork of lightning branched across the heavens, and for one silent, terrible heartbeat, the entire world went white. In that stark, absolute illumination, Nolan's gaze was dragged downward. He saw it all laid bare in the ghostly light, the dying ranch, the battered barn, and the dark, accusing mouth of the old, dry well. And the past came for him. The roar of the wind became the roar of a consuming fire. The groaning of the tower's wood became the crack and splinter of burning timbers. The rain on his face was no longer rain. It was the sting of hot ash, the sweat of pure animal terror. He was back there in that other night of smoke and screams, his hands raw on the handle of that same damned pump, pulling, 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 as his wife shrieked his name from the upstairs window of their burning home. He could feel the useless hollow thud of the piston hitting the bottom of the dry well. No water, no hope, just the smell of fire and the sound of his world turning to ash. No, he whispered the sound, lost in the storm's fury. He stopped climbing, his body going rigid. He clung to a crossbeam, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with a horror that was 20 years old. The present had vanished. He was a ghost, trapped in his own memory, hanging from a monument to a failure he had been foolish enough to repeat. Nolan Lilly's scream was sharp, immediate. It cut through the fog of his memory, but he couldn't respond. "It's no good," he yelled back, his voice a ragged torrent of despair. "Leave it, run. It's all a lie, don't you see? Everything I build, everything I touch, it's cursed to burn." He saw her face below him, pale and streaked with rain, her expression shifting from fear to a kind of furious disbelief. She didn't retreat. She kept climbing. She climbed past him, her small hands and feet finding holds with a desperate, tenacious grip until she was level with his head. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but her eyes were blazing. "Get up!" she shrieked, her voice thin but powerful against the howl of the tempest. "It's over, girl. Go!" he pleaded, his resolve shattered. There was no water then. There's no hope now. "My town had a well like that," she screamed back, shaking his arm, her touch a jolt of reality. "When the fever came, it went dry. My pa, the watchmaker, he just sat on his porch. He just sat and watched everyone get sick. He said, 'Some things you can't fight, Lily.' He gave up. Tears were streaming down her face, now mixing with the rain, her small body trembling with a grief and rage that mirrored his own. "I won't," she cried, her voice breaking but filled with an iron will that stunned him. "I will not be beaten by a dry hole in the ground, Nolan. He was wrong. Now get up and help me." Her pain, so raw, so real, was a shock of ice water to his burning soul. He looked at her truly, looked at her, and saw not just a girl but a fighter. He saw the same choice he had faced 20 years ago, but this time reflected in her fierce, tear-streaked eyes, he saw a different answer. A new strength born of a terrible consuming shame, and a desperate primal need to protect her from the fate his own family had met surged through him. He was no longer fighting for a machine, he was fighting for her. He began to move. Together they were a blur of synchronized desperation. He used his strength to hold the bucking blade steady while her smaller, nimbler hands worked the ropes, lashing it to the tower. One blade, then another. The storm reached its crescendo, a deafening, insane roar. They worked on the final blade, their movements clumsy with exhaustion, the wind threatening to rip their very bones apart. With a final shared grunt of effort, they pulled the last rope taut and knotted it. It was done. The shriek of the blades ceased, replaced by the deep, shuddering groan of the tower as it took the full blunt force of the wind. But it held. The tower held. They collapsed against the wet wood, clinging to the rungs, clinging to each other, two battered, breathless survivors in the screaming heart of the storm. The wind howled its fury, but it could not touch them. They had won. Dawn broke not with a bang, but with a whisper. The tempest had screamed itself hoarse and moved on, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly, profoundly silent. The air, stripped of its dust and fury, smelled of rain-soaked earth and the clean, sharp scent of distant sage. From their perch, high on the tower, Nolan and Lily watched as the first gentle rays of sun touched the horizon, painting the bruised clouds in hues of soft rose and pale gold. The windmill, their strange and battered ark, stood whole. It was scarred and tested, one of the tin blades bent at a tortured angle, but it was standing. They had held the line. The descent was slow, a journey through the aching landscape of their own bodies. Every muscle screamed in protest, their hands were raw and scraped their clothes soaked through. But as Nolan's feet touched the solid muddy ground, he felt a lightness in his soul that he hadn't known for 20 years. The fear was gone. The storm, both outside and in, had finally broken. He looked at Lily, her face pale and smudged with dirt, her small frame trembling with exhaustion, and he was overwhelmed by a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees, a fierce protective gratitude. She had not run. He slumped down onto the wet earth, oblivious to the mud, his strength finally deserting him. He looked at the old dry well, its dark mouth now filled with storm water, and the story he had held inside him like a shard of glass began to work its way out. Her name was Eleanor. He began, his voice a low, rough rasp. Lily, who had been inspecting the tower's base, grew still and sat on the ground a few feet away, her quiet presence an invitation. She loved this land, said it was honest. It never pretended to be anything but hard. He picked up a wet stone, turning it over and over in his palm. Our daughter Sarah. She had Eleanor's laugh, a sound like a running creek. He paused, the memory of physical pain. The fire started in the barn, a stray spark from the lantern. The wind was high that night, too, a dry, hateful wind. He didn't look at Lily. He couldn't. He looked at the well. I ran for the water, the pump. It was new then. My own newfangled machine. I was so proud of it. But the well was going dry. I pumped. God, how I pumped. But there was nothing, just air and dust. His voice broke the sound, a raw, tearing thing. I heard them screaming my name, and I stood there at a dry well and I listened to my world burn down. He finally fell silent, the confession laid bare between them in the quiet morning light. The stone fell from his slack fingers. He waited for her to say something, a word of pity, of comfort. But Lily did nothing. She simply sat there, a steadfast witness, sharing the weight of his sorrow without trying to fix it. Her silence was a greater gift than any words could ever be. After a long time, he pushed himself to his feet. There was one last thing to do. They worked with a shared, solemn purpose, their movements slow but efficient. They reconnected the pump rod to the gear hub. They climbed the tower one last time, their bodies screaming in protest, and untied the ropes that held the great blades hostage. They released them one by one into the clean morning air. They descended and stood back side by side, their eyes fixed on the spout of the pipe that led to the long empty cattle trough. The wind, now a gentle but steady friend, caught the blades. They began to turn, not with the frantic shriek of the night before, but with the slow, powerful rhythmic grace they were designed for. Creak, groan, turn. The pump rod began its journey. Up, down, a steady promising pulse. The silence was absolute. Nolan held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. The old doubt, the fear of failure, coiled in his gut. Please, he thought, a prayer to a God he had long since abandoned. Just once. Let it be enough. A hollow gurgle echoed from deep within the pipe. a pause that stretched for an eternity. Then, a single brown drop of water fell from the spout, hitting the dusty bottom of the trough with a soft pat. Another, a third. A muddy, sputtering trickle began a pathetic stream that seemed a mockery of their efforts. Nolan's heart sank. And then the gurgle became a rush. The trickle became a torrent. With a great cleansing gush, the water burst forth no longer brown but clear and strong and impossibly beautiful. It was a liquid song, a roar of life that filled the morning air as it crashed into the trough, splashing over the sides. Nolan stared, his mind unable to process the sight, the sound. It was real. He stumbled forward and fell to his knees in the mud beside the trough. He plunged his hands into the gushing stream, the water so cold it was almost painful, washing over his scarred, trembling fingers. It was the sound of salvation. A laugh pure and silver and filled with an uncontainable joy bubbled up from Lily's throat. And Nolan, the man whose heart had been a desert for 2 decades, finally let his own dam break. He knelt in the mud in the life-giving water, and he wept. He wept for the wife and daughter he had lost, for the years he had wasted, and for the impossible miraculous grace of a second chance delivered by a stubborn child, and the power of the wind. 6 months later, the ranch was learning a new language. It was not the dry, rasping tongue of dust and decay, but the soft green whisper of new grass pushing through damp, dark earth. The wind, once a mourner, was now a musician, playing a steady rhythmic tune on the blades of the great windmill that stood as the undisputed heart of the valley. Water, clean and abundant, flowed in the troughs, and the cattle, healthy and strong, grazed on land that was no longer a memory of failure, but a testament to a miracle. The change was most profound in the man himself. The ghost who had haunted the property was gone, replaced by a man who moved with a lighter step, whose shoulders were no longer bowed by the weight of unspoken grief. Nolan was teaching Lily how to ride his voice, once a harsh growl, now patient and warm, as he corrected her posture in the saddle. "Easy on the reins, daughter," he said, the word daughter as natural to him now as breathing. "You don't command a horse with force. You ask. You listen." He looked over at the new crudely carved sign he had hammered into place by the entrance to their lane. It read, "Nolan and Daughter." He still felt a jolt of quiet disbelief every time he saw it. He had been so certain that his story was over, a tragedy written in ash. He had not known there could be another chapter, a final part written in water and wind by the small, greasy hand of a girl who saw the harmony in things. They rode into town that afternoon, the wagon loaded with goods to trade. It was their first trip together since the storm. As they moved down the main street, something was different. The townsfolk who had once averted their gazes from the broken man on the parched ranch now looked up. They nodded. Jedediah, the old rancher, tipped his hat from the porch of the mercantile, a look of genuine respect in his eyes. The blacksmith paused his hammering to raise a hand in greeting. Their gazes would often drift to the horizon, to the distant turning blades of the windmill which could just be seen from the edge of town. It had become a landmark, a legend. Nolan felt no pride, no smugness, just a quiet, peaceful sense of belonging he had thought was lost to him forever. That evening, they sat together on the porch, the day's work done. The setting sun bathed the reborn valley in a warm golden light. The air was cool and sweet. The windmill turned with its steady, comforting creak and groan, the sound no longer a noise but a lullaby. They sat in a comfortable silence, a father and a daughter, watching the world settle into a gentle peace. My Pa Lily said softly, her voice carrying on the evening breeze, the watchmaker. He used to say the wind was just empty air, a nuisance that made the dust fly and rattled the windows. Nolan looked from her thoughtful face to the great turning blades outlined against the twilight sky. He saw the sum of their shared struggle, their fear, their impossible victory. He saw his redemption turning gracefully in the wind. He placed a heavy, gentle hand on her shoulder. "He was a good man. Your Pa Nolan," said his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. a man who understood small, perfect things. But he was wrong about that. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the last light of the day, and in them she saw not the ghost of the man he had been, but the soul of the man he had become. The wind sprocket. He said, his voice a quiet, certain truth. It turns out, it's full of everything that matters.